Hey guys, welcome to a special institution, or instance, I guess you could say, of Turn2. That didn't work out as well. I'm Doa. Obviously, everybody else is at that Hearthstone thing in Germany right now. So today, we're fortunate enough to be joined by Ben Brode, who is one of the senior developers on Hearthstone from Blizzard Entertainment. How's it going, man?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. So your official title is senior game designer. So tell me first, like, what does that mean? Like, what do you actually do with Hearthstone here?
Well, I do a lot of things, and kind of that's the vibe
Kind of a broad
Team 5.
title.
We do, well, everybody on Team 5 is kind of a generalist and helps do all kinds of crazy things. I do programming, I do game design, I design features. I helped kind of come up with Eric Dodds with kind of what the core gameplay is. What is this game? How does it work? I'm working on, I did the tutorial missions with a lot of feedback from a lot of people. We all do a lot of things, but I help, mostly the game designers help kind of coalesce ideas. You know, a lot of the ideas come from all over the company and the team, and we try and figure out what are those best ideas and get everybody bought in to something that everybody's excited about.
Okay, that's cool. And then you and I were just talking a few minutes ago about like our CCG backgrounds and things like that. And you've played like a ton of CCGs over the years, right?
Yeah, I actually made a list and it ended up being like 30 TCGs long.
I think like a lot of kids like during that age, like my brother and I were the same where whatever came out, we'd play it, whether it was like Dragon Ball or Mech Warrior, like whatever it was. Yeah. If there were cards involved, we would pick it up.
Absolutely.
But so Hearthstone has been in beta for a while now. It's developed. We've seen the meta game shift and shift and shift. It's been really, really cool. The decks we saw at the BlizzCon tournament are completely different now than the decks we see at the top level, which is one of the cool things about CCGs. But I just want to put this question out there first, that in terms of just where Hearthstone is at right now, you know, and we could say balance-wise, just game development-wise, like, if we're talking about like the loading bar that goes up before the game starts, like what percentage is Hearthstone at right now?
Balance-wise.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Well, you know, it's one of the interesting things about the metagame, and the metagame for people who don't like speak that kind of TCG parlance is like the decks that people are playing right now. The gamut, the gauntlet of decks you're going to play against as you play in ranked mode or whatever changes constantly. And I don't know if there is a 100% on that meter, right? Like I don't know if it ends and then this is the decks everyone is playing, this one deck or these 3 decks or these 5 decks or whatever. Because at any point, if a deck becomes very common, you see it often, then there's cards probably that are better against those decks, and so you could tweak your deck to become kind of that deck killer. And that changes. So now that this deck was really popular, but now the deck that kills that deck becomes popular. And now, so that first deck becomes less popular. And then the deck that kills this deck becomes more popular. And so things kind of by their nature in card games shift. And I think they shift more dramatically and more often earlier on in an environment. So whenever we release new cards, things will be shifting kind of crazily. But even in kind of a mature environment, I think things still shift pretty often.
Yeah, I'd agree. So now I guess that kind of brings this question to mind now, as far as like how Blizzard, how you guys approach balancing Hearthstone. It's kind of a unique situation because you've got this competitive scene that's coming up, and you've got the ladder, which is obviously, you know, part of the actual game, whereas the tournaments are kind of like exterior to that. So when you balance, do you think more about just the ladder itself, about the person that brings in one deck, and that one deck just has to be as good as it can be against, you know, multiple different decks? Or do you want to, you know, maybe in the future include something like some sort of a sideboard system like we had like Magic the Gathering? So someone could take sort of a different approach to deck building if they were going into more of a competitive side of things, where they're playing these other tournaments. Like which direction kind of is the balance going, sort of? One deck that beats all, or the ability to kind of modify your decks on the fly for competitive play?
Well, I think it's not that you want to build a deck that beats all. It's that you want to build a deck that you think is going to do well against kind of what you expect to see when you hit play. So, like, for example, right now, a lot of people are playing mage decks, specifically kind of ones that specialize in freezing your minions, and then kind of duking you out with Pyroblast and Fireball at the end game. And so you may think, okay, I know I'm going to see a lot of that, so maybe a Healing Touch is really good. It's kind of like a reverse Pyroblast for much less mana. So those are the kinds of decisions that you may not want to put that in your... If you have a sideboard, then that implies that you are playing a lot of games against the same person, right? Because you're tweaking your deck subtly to
Sure, a
counter
little
their
card here
specific
and
deck.
there. Yeah.
Right. Or maybe even a lot more, as in the case of other card games. But I think if you're really kind of understanding the metagame and what people are playing, that's actually more challenging to get it right the first time. To come into the ladder with a deck that is good against the decks that you expect to face.
Right.
And a sideboard kind of makes that bit of skill kind of less important, because you can kind of go in with something and then change it to whatever you actually do end up running against. So analysis of the meta becomes less important with a sideboard, I think, for our ranked play. And tournaments are really exciting to us. Something that we kind of expected might be cool, but kind of took off more than we even thought. And so we definitely want to support those types of things in the future. Right now, we're laser focused on getting the game to open beta and then release.
That makes sense.
But those are types of things that we care a lot about, and we know are very desired by people who are participating in those tournaments and things. So it's stuff we'll look at for the future.
Okay. Now everybody in chat is talking about mages, so let's just get out of the way. Let's talk about mages right now.
Sure.
And there's a couple different ways, obviously, you can play mages. I feel like the rise of the current mage came with the counter, where people trying to counter that very strong Warlock deck, the strong mid-range aggro stuff. So we were seeing the Frost Giants mage deck, right, which with a bunch of CC, a bunch of AoE, and then kind of big minions to kind of like drive that home, along with Pyroblast and things like that. But now we're seeing a lot of upper mid-range mage decks be very strong on the ladder as well. And so that brings me to the question where I feel like the strength in mage is certainly the AoE. I mean, that seems fairly obvious. Mages have, more efficient, more damaging AoE than the other classes. Generally, the thought that comes up when I'm discussing mages with other people is that mages can do with one card what it usually takes 2 cards for other classes to do. Right. So me being a big World of Warcraft fan, I've been playing for a long time, it feels like that's kind of something that's supposed to be part of playing a mage. But do you feel like it's a little bit too strong? Do you feel like mage needs a nerf right now? And I know we just had a patch, but the meta is constantly changing, like we talked about. So
do you
think Mage Knight might need some looking at, or do you think you might want to actually buff some of the AoE for the other classes?
I think the evolution of the meta over the past 2 months even has been really fascinating, right? Like for a while, everyone was playing kind of these end game kind of control decks. That was kind of the meta. And actually, if you have 2 decks kind of pair up against each other, you want to be a little bit slower than the other guy. You want him to kind of run out of juice. And so as things moved along, this deck would be better, and then that's the better deck, so people want to be this deck, and then that's the better deck, so people want to be this deck, and get slower and slower, and eventually it got so slow that there's this huge gap, and now these really fast Warlock decks are able to come in and just wreck these decks. And then mages come in and beat these decks, and maybe there's some decks that crush these new mage decks. I know that I've been experimenting with some Paladin and Druid decks that have done really well against a lot of these Frost mages. But I think, and this kind of happened with Priest when Priest was kind of seeing its heyday early on in the last patch, is that the Priest was very frustrating to play against. We worked really hard in Hearthstone to not do things that say you can't do this, but do things that say you do this awesome thing. So I get to do awesome stuff, and then I say go, and your opponent gets to do awesome stuff, and it feels like everything feels awesome. And mind control felt kind of not that. It felt like I don't get to do my awesome thing. You get to do it instead.
Or you take their awesome thing, basically.
Right. Yeah. And so people had a very visceral response to that. We heard a lot of feedback about that. And people are telling us now that, maybe the mage freezing you over and over and over and over feels a little bit like that. It feels like I don't get to mess with my cool stuff. I never get to attack or do anything fun. So I don't know that the mage is dramatically overpowered. It may not even need any changes. It's something we are looking at for sure. We pay a lot of attention to the statistics already. There's lots of games being played in the new patch and ranked mode. We're seeing all that stuff come in and checking on the back end. But it's certainly a big note for us is that it's frustrating to play against, and almost that's in sometimes more important than actually is it balanced. I mean, you could build decks that beat these mage decks. I think I built this druid deck that runs Cold Light Oracles and King Mukla and tries to fill up my opponent's hand with cards, naturalize, and then I just burn cards off the top of their deck, and I burn away their Pyroblast. And I'm like, you have no chance now. I'm not worried about giants because Naturalize eats them. And anyway, there's some fun decks that counter these decks, I think.
Okay, yeah, I mean, and when we saw mage decks being very strong earlier, we did see priests come up, and druid come up, a lot of that stuff, because mage doesn't have as much, single target removal as some of the other classes do too. So, and ladder-wise, it is a situation where you see these cycles, sort of where things go through, and I think you are right there. But and I suppose, I mean, it all depends on, I guess, that competitive side of things. And now my viewpoint is a bit skewed because I'm very much on the competitive side of thing, whereas we do have to admit, at the end of the day, most players are going to be playing this thing casually. Most players are just going to be on the ladder, trying out their decks and things like that. So it's a tough position, actually, that you guys are in, to have to sort of think about the ladder and think about things like that, and then also have this competitive scene that's just kind of going to be there, and like, do you make any little changes for it? And one thing I have appreciated, actually, that the team has done is not done too many knee-jerk reaction kind of changes where it's like, oh no, we need to patch this immediately, kind of thing, because you do have to kind of wait for those cycles to sort of go through.
Yeah, I mean, things do move, right? Things change.
They do.
Even very dramatically sometimes. And so, I read some feedback. People were saying, hey, you've changed priest, you changed hunter, but mage was clearly on top, kind of, especially at tournaments being run outside the game and things at the time of the patch, and there weren't any mage changes. And it's something that we're paying attention. We notice these things. But it's unfair to say that this is not necessarily unfair. It's just not accurate to say this is how it is now and how it's always going to be. It might, and we may need to do something, right? But it's players are really creative, and as things start to become shift towards one way or the other, players come up with really interesting counters to deck archetypes or specific decks that are being played, and we like to give players the power and the time to try and solve these metagames on their own before we come in and just declare what the metagame is going to be all the time. And so, I definitely think we have more balanced changes to make before open beta and ship. But we're not exactly sure where they want to be, where they are going to be, and we want to be really careful that we don't kind of knee-jerk respond and change too much and
totally.
Just make everybody frazzled, not trust that the system is there.
Yeah, it is good to kind of take some time. I think especially with the mage decks coming up so fast, it's good to give it some time to sort of like settle down and see what happens. But let's talk a little bit about the patch changes that just happened recently. And I guess I want to talk first about a change that didn't happen, which I'm a little bit surprised about. Blood Imp, the Warlock card that gives +1 health to everything else on the board, and it's stealthed, of course, just to kind of tell the chat in case they're not familiar with the card I'm talking about. But Blood Imp wasn't touched at all. And that was really one of the cards that at the top level people were talking a lot about, because it's such an anti-AoE card, and that it makes everything stronger against AoE, and the only way to kill it itself is with AoE, which it is naturally strong against. So I'm a little bit surprised there were no changes for Blood Imp. I'd like to hear your opinions on that card right now.
It's strong, and it's on our watch list, I'll say. We have a bunch of cards that we're kind of looking at and seeing, are these a problem, really? Is it a kind of a flavor of the month type thing, or is this really frustrating or really breaking a specific archetype? And I'm not sure, but it's something that we are looking at. We didn't make very many changes, and actually some of the changes, certainly Argent Commander has been kind of in favor. It's kind of been part of the metagame for a very long time, and it was kind of time for us to say, okay, look, this guy's not going away.
Shattered Sun Cleric as well.
Right, those guys were kind of reducing players' deck building options at those mana costs, and Blood Imp is kind of a semi-newer entry into that the metagame sort of. People are really starting to play these fast Warlock decks, and so we tried a Flame Imp change because we were confident that it wasn't going to be a major change, and if we do something to Blood Imp. It's there's not a lot of numbers there, right? We could maybe make him 0 attack if it's necessary, but we want to make sure if we do change Blood Imp, it's going to be the right change, and we want to make sure we test it a lot. So we're looking at it, but as you guys know, the metagame is already shifting and changing, and so and Shattered Sun Cleric actually made a big kind of impact on those decks by having 2 health, and now it's more vulnerable to AoE. So. I guess I'll just say we're looking at it, and potentially there might be changes, or you guys will find some new solutions to that card.
Okay. We saw a lot of nerfs. We've seen a lot of nerfs on strong cards over the cycle of the Hearthstone beta so far, but we haven't seen quite as many buffs to weaker cards. And I will say I do think that that is a little bit more difficult to do than nerf a strong card because it's hard to kind of gauge the impact, especially if it's a neutral minion, if you're going to buff something. But does that kind of reflect a little bit about what the team's sort of balanced philosophy is overall, that you'd rather nerf than buff, or what do you think?
Well, I don't think that we'd rather nerf than buff, but at this phase of the project where we're getting close to open beta and we really want to stop making balance changes and let kind of the players have the control, we want to do the least risky things, right? We want to kind of get us into the range where everything feels balanced. And we were doing those types of changes a lot over the development of the game. For example, Leper Gnome used to be a 1/1. Abusive Sergeant used to be a 1/1. And a lot of other cards kind of used to be much less powerful, and we buffed those over time because I think it especially when you're in the arena and you're trying to choose between cards, it's fun if that's a hard choice and that they feel kind of close together in power. This one's maybe better for this type of deck I'm building or whatever, and so we want those to be kind of around those in this. We don't want cards that are just awful, but at this point, you change one number, right? You make a 2/1 into a 3/1 or a 1/3, and suddenly everything changes, right? Suddenly these types of minions are better than these types of minions, and that could shake things up too much and not give us enough time to react. Not that we won't make changes post ship if we need to, but we just want to be careful. I think slight nerfs are the safest type of change that don't maybe shake things up too much, and we can go crazy in the adventures that we're going to release with all the new cards and expansions in the future. That's a good place to introduce crazy new things and try new balance ideas there. But we're getting pretty close to the open beta here. So,
okay, how close?
We said at BlizzCon that we're shooting for still this year, but that's a very aggressive target, I would say. So,
all right,
we'll see.
We are in the last month of the year, so
I mean, there's not that many days left in the end of the year. True.
That's right. Okay, well, we'll wait to see what happens there. I did have another question as far as like neutral minions and things like that goes. Now, right now, all the neutral cards are minions.
Yes.
What do you think about neutral spells? I mean, again, that's a big balance impact, but in future expansions, are neutral spells something that you want to look into possibly as either something to, balance something out to give something that one class may have to everybody to kind of balance it that way, or do you just want to put it in? It'd be cool to have neutral spells, right?
We have a couple neutral spells that are not collectible, like bananas is a neutral spell.
It's true. Technically, yes, there are some neutral spells, yes.
But there's no reason we couldn't do it, right? Like except for I don't know, maybe exploring the collection manager or something and being able to tell the difference between them. I don't know. There's no reason why we couldn't do it technically. Actually, the biggest reason we haven't done them so far is just kind of understanding kind of what that neutral pool is, and also like the fantasy of a neutral spell. Like, what is that? I understand when a mage casts Fireball, but what is this neutral spell? Is it like kicking the jimmies or something? Like anybody could kick a guy in the jimmies, I guess. But
that's true. I mean, we could that into anybody.
What do you make that's that everybody feels like, oh yeah, he would cast that. So that
I
kind of
expect the kick to the jimmies card to come out in the next expansion. I'm going to be waiting for that one. All right.
There was some flavor text that had those words in it, and Dodds maybe cut it out. So.
All right. Well, maybe we convince him. We need that community support, right? So I wanted to talk about one class in particular as well, and that a class that seems to kind of be a little bit left by the wayside is that warriors. These poor warriors, people just don't exactly know what they're supposed to do. It seems like, they're supposed to be armor, seems like they're supposed to be equipment-based, but yet it still seems like it's difficult to make a truly top-level competitive warrior deck. I mean, warriors are good, but they are kind of the bottom of the totem pole right now in the Hearthstone classes. So what can you tell us about warriors? Like, how do you feel about where the class is at right now? What can you do with the warrior? How do you fix a problem like a warrior?
Well, I'll say that I think actually there are some incredible warrior decks, but the problem is kind of the most fun way to build a warrior, and a lot of the deck building tools we put in kind of drive you to a warrior deck that's actually not as powerful as you imagine it would be. The enrage warrior decks are harder to get to go off. You have the dream, you're like, oh, I'm going to do this, and then play this card and this card, and then often you just don't have guys, so you can't attack after you enrage your guys, and so it doesn't end up being as strong as you imagined it might be. But there are some other warrior decks. I've certainly had success with warrior decks that didn't try and enrage minions, I guess. One particular play that I think is really strong is Fell Iron Axing on turn 2, killing their 2-drop. Then on turn 3, you kill their 3-drop, and you play King Mukla on an empty board, and they don't have anybody to play Bananas on, and it's pretty amazing. So I certainly have seen great warrior play, and we can look at individual decks, right? We can go into the database and pull any player's deck and see the win ratio for their warrior deck or their paladin deck or whatever. And there's some warrior decks that are doing amazing, but they're not common, right? They're using kind of off, builds that are maybe different than most players are using right now. So, we could see some changes to maybe those types of decks that players really want to play with warrior. I think giving players tools to build a deck and then also making sure that deck is a viable deck is, when we can do that, that's a great thing to do. So, those types of things are on our watch list as well. I guess I'll say is there changes we need to make, or they're just kind of undiscovered decks that players haven't found yet, like the right mix of enrage minions and ways to enrage them that could be really powerful that we just haven't seen yet. Or maybe they're actually good, but the decks that are popular in the current meta are keeping those decks down, and when other decks crop up to defeat the current meta of decks, then these decks are actually weak against warriors and other decks, and now warriors come back into fashion. So that kind of thing happens sometimes where a class feels weak, but then depending on what's popular, they become stronger.
And I think you hit the nail on the head too with Warrior when you said the cards right now seem to want to push players along a certain path, but that path isn't quite as competitive as some of the other paths from some of the other classes right now too. So personally, my favorite class in World of Warcraft is Warrior. I've played an Arms Warrior for years. The idea of making a deck where I could just equip all these weapons and get a ton of armor and just not really worry about minions, but just fight with my hero. That's where I've been trying to go with Warrior, but it is tough. So I'd love to see some changes, maybe to armor, something like that, something to let Arms Warriors be Arms Warriors. Even though people always say Fury has the top DPS. I don't care. I'm going to play Arms anyway. It doesn't matter to me, but that's interesting. Okay. So one thing I do want to address, because it keeps coming up, and I'm, as far as my personal opinions on this topic go, I'm sort of okay with it, with where Hearthstone is at right now, but let's mention the coin. Let's talk about the coin a little bit still.
Oh, sure.
People are still talking about it, and I feel like the turn 2 advantage, isn't as strong. There's certainly a lot of decks out there that you want to be going turn 1, so it's not about who goes first necessarily, but the fact that the coin is still a card in hand, is it still a spell when you cast it, this still bothers a lot of people, and it does bother me a little bit too. So without talking about win rates and things like that, and impact that statistically the coin is happening, what do you think of as far as the coin goes, as a game mechanic? It feels awkward to kind of have it that way, but how do you change it?
Well, I want to back up a little bit and talk about kind of the past, the history of kind of where we ended up here and some of the path we took, because I think it's interesting. Once upon a time, there was no mechanic to kind of equalize those win percentages, right? It was just like, if you go first, you go first. That was it. And it was dominant. Players going first were winning 80% of the time or something. So we cut one card from their hands. Now they draw 3 and your opponent draws 4. And we're like, okay, awesome. Hopefully that'll help. And they were still winning like 70 or 65% of their games or something massive. Players were really frustrated every time they lost the coin flip. They're like, oh, this sucks. I lost 3 times in a row on the coin flip. How am I going to win in the games? So we started really kind of thinking, what are some things we could try to bridge this gap and get it closer to 50-50? And 50-50 isn't even necessarily the goal. If we can get it to 55-45 or something, that's within range. That sounds good to us. And we tried a lot of things. We tried maybe player 2 starts with some extra health, and that way, player 1 maybe peters out and gives player 2 some time to come back. And that actually kind of worked, but it didn't feel very good. You felt kind of at the mercy of player 1 still. Every turn they have 1 more mana than you. And we tried other things, like maybe player 2 starts with a 1/1 in play or something, and then they can attack right away. We even tried one where player 2's first minion gets +1/+1, so they start with a bigger minion than you. Wow. And none of those felt as good as the coin. And there's a couple things specifically about the way the coin works right now that I think that are kind of cool. The first is obviously that it works at bridging the gap. The win ratio between going first and going second is very close to 50%, very slightly favoring winning the coin flip. So it's slightly better to go first still. So that's great. It solves the problem, and it does it, I think, in a really interesting way, because it gives player 2 like the feeling of control, which they don't get from like those other ideas like +5 health. You don't feel more powerful with +5 health, but with the coin, it gives you options. You got, can I use it now? Do I use it next turn or the turn after? Like, when's the right time to use this? And when you do use it, it's like it's something active. It's something you drag this card out into the field. You hear it goes boom, and you get the extra mana, and it's kind of a little bit of a ceremony moment. And your opponent sees the coin slide out, and they're like, "Oh, what is he going to do?" That I'm super worried about what's about to happen. And so I think that's a really cool moment that the coin gives us. And then as far as it being a spell, that's actually something that we argued a lot about, because it could have not been a spell, but it actually might have made the card or the mechanic more complicated for new players. Already, I think the mechanic is complicated for new players. I had somebody who didn't know I worked on the Hearthstone team try and explain the game to me, actually. He was like, "Oh, I'm playing this new game called Hearthstone." And I was like, "Oh, that sounds fun." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, it's cool. Sometimes you get the coin randomly, though." And I was like, "No, you get it for going second." And so already it's a little bit complicated. And it being a spell already kind of maps to things you understand about the game, right? You understand how you can play spells and how you can kind of drag them onto the battlefield and they'll take effect. So it kind of builds into this kind of knowledge we've already taught you about the game. And that's good. But also, even just from a game balance perspective, these numbers being so close together are based on the coin counting as a spell. So, like they'd like already, for example, the mage is better going first. And if you took away the ability for the coin to make Mana Worm bigger or whatever, then now they'd be even worse going second. And so it would be making the balance potentially worse. Oh, thanks for fixing my light.
You're being assumed into the afterlife there for a second. I guess we'll have to wrap this up.
We could make it not a spell, and I think it would make it maybe less intuitive for new players, and it would actually make the balance less far from 50-50. It'd be even better to go first than it already is. As a really long way to answer your very simple question.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. I think the coin is going to be kind of a point of contention for people pretty much for the life of Hearthstone. But it's interesting to hear the opinions on that. Something else a lot of people have talked about, and I know we're kind of hitting that 30 minutes. So if we need to end this, just let me know. But I wanted to fit one more question here. But...
Bring it on. Let's go.
Okay. All right. We'll do it. Okay. Great. Thanks a lot. So as far as hand sizes go, too, has there been any thought to increasing the hand sizes for each player? Because some people make the argument that being only able to mulligan 3 cards for going first is a lot weaker than being able to mulligan 4 cards for going second.
It is a lot.
It's a big deal. So what do you think? I mean, are we going to see any hand size increases? Possibly the ability for the guy who goes first to mulligan his first draw as well? Like, what do you think?
So, I mean, those things that you mentioned would make going first better, right? And right now, going first is already better, right? You'd rather, I mean, it doesn't feel like it because the emotion of having the coin and the power behind it, like you remember that. It's something that feels good. But actually, the statistics that we're seeing when we look at every single game that's played, for some classes, even it's 6% better going first. And so making that even better to go first actually would kind of put more emphasis on that coin flip than we're maybe comfortable with. So we could, potentially increase the hand size of both players, but that actually decreases the percentage difference between the players, and in that way also makes going first better. And even aside from all that, one of the things that we tried this a lot. We tried, 5-card hands and 6-card hands and 2-card hands with a 2-card draw and 5-card hands where you discard your hand at the end of each turn and draw 5 new cards, right? Like we tried a lot of different kind of card draw and hand size configurations. And there's just kind of like in the arena where when you have 3 cards to choose from, it feels really good. It feels better than 2 cards or 4 cards or 5 cards. There's a kind of a decision point where that number of decisions feels like an interesting number. And certainly I've played in games where I have a 10-card hand and all of them are playable. And it's too much. It's almost way too many choices to think about, especially the order in which I play them, who I attack. And there's some number of choices, obviously, that aren't really that interesting. Okay, it's turn 1, I have a Flame Imp, I play the Flame Imp. That's not a choice. But actually, those 3 or 4 card hands give us the most of the time those interesting numbers of decisions. Like, do I play this or this? They have wildly different impacts based on what my opponent's going to do next, and I have to kind of predict that. Those hand sizes were best for that.
Okay. Now, I want to completely change gears here for a second. And again, you know, feel free to say you're out of time at any time. I'm going to keep asking questions as long as... Okay, good. So, and this is one of the questions that we got on Reddit, which I think is an interesting one. They say, you know, we've got this unranked play for the ladder, you know, where you can kind of test out decks and things like that. What about the possibility of an unranked arena, whereas in you don't get any rewards, you just kind of like go through the motions of doing an unranked arena thing, you know, to get players who maybe want to try arena but are a little bit worried about investing that gold or that money to do it, you know, so any chance of an unranked arena?
Well, I'll tell you, we were definitely worried about that type of player who is kind of scared of arena, and he's like, okay, you know, this has an investment. It maybe feels a little hardcore. And that's why we gave everybody a free arena run when they get a new account, because I feel like arena is really fun. I don't want anyone to be like, I don't know what that is. You know, it costs gold. Forget it. I want everybody to try it and see kind of, oh wow, this is really a fun way to build a deck. It's a really fun mode. There's prizes. That's awesome. So we were concerned about those types of players. And in general, actually, some kind of interesting philosophy for you about features and modes is that we're really, I guess, fiercely passionate about controlling the number of features and modes that are going to change the user interface. You know, I think we've all seen kind of options menus that are, you open up the options menu, you're like, oh man, I can't even find the thing I'm looking for. And the Hearthstone options menu is very simple, and intentionally so. We really want to make sure that not just the options menu, that's just kind of one symptom, but everywhere we kind of do the minimum amount of user interface. And we spent a really long time in the collection manager kind of paring things down to get to a spot where a new player would open up the collection manager and wouldn't go, oh, you know, like it has to be kind of inviting and friendly and feel like, oh, I could learn this. I can figure this out. There's not too many, you know, modes and buttons and things. And then aside from just kind of user interface, kind of the ability to figure out, am I in the ranked arena or the casual arena? The number of buckets that we separate our players into is important, right? Like we have casual, we have ranked, we have arena, we have practice, and friendly games. And already our players are now like kind of separated into 5 places they could be. And so imagine a world where we had 30 different game modes, right? All with very interesting different rules. Maybe this is a legendaries only version, right. And this is everybody has 5 life, or this is everybody has 10 seconds to take their turn, or who knows. But now you queue for a game and you wait 10 minutes because there's nobody else who's really interested in that mode, and so our buckets get very thin. And even if you do find a match, it's probably not a very fair match. And so those are concerns for us. We want to make sure that we give players fast matchmaking with really fun matches. And so that's something that, one extra bucket probably wouldn't make too much of a difference. But we have some cool ideas. Maybe we want to add more buckets in the future. And so we have to be kind of careful of where we put those buckets.
That's true. There you go. And of course, if you're going to put on tablets and things like that as well, you can't have too much clutter there. So sure. Speaking of tablets, hold on a second. I've got this iPad here.
Beautiful.
So I've been in the beta for a long time, but when am I going to be able to play this on the subway and stuff like that?
We're working really hard on it. We have a lot of really talented engineers who are doing some really cool stuff with the iPad interface to really make it feel great on iPad. So I'm excited for you to get to play it, but it's something that we're still working on, and it's not going to happen before the release of the game. So around then probably is when we're looking to.
All right,
I'm not sure the exact timeline.
Okay, sounds good. Well, let's see. Here's the thing. Okay, I already know what you're going to say. But the community would be furious at me if I didn't pose this question. Expansions. any news on expansions? Do you want to have more cards on release? Do you want to give it a bit of time to percolate and then bring something out? Like, all right, tell us where things are at expansions wise.
Well, I'll tell you that getting that pace of new cards correct is really important, because there are players who are really excited about new cards, and you know, the pace that we deliver them couldn't be fast enough, right? We could release 10 new cards every day, and they'd be like, "Bring it on, keep coming, you know, keep it coming." But also, you know, we're still in closed beta. Most people who are going to play Hearthstone potentially haven't even, you know, got into the beta or tried it yet. So, especially as we go to iPad, maybe introduce the game to a whole new market of players. Those players are going to come in and see. I mean, there's a lot of cards in the basic and expert sets that might be overwhelming if we immediately start dumping new cards on a player base who's just kind of understanding, even maybe never even tried a card game before, which a lot of players who are new to Hearthstone haven't. So I'm just, I guess, concerned that if we go too fast, we could alienate those players and overwhelm them. But you know, I'm super hardcore. Obviously, I've been playing this game for many years, even before the beta and all that. And I'm still having a ton of fun with the cards we have out, but I'm obviously very excited about new cards. And so we want to make sure that we do release new cards for those hardcore players. And that's why I think our strategy of doing these adventures, where we release kind of a series of like single-player content for you to play and earn cards by playing against the single-player content. They're a kind of a smaller number, between 20 and 30 cards is what we're looking at right now. Will give you kind of that infusion of new strategies and content and interesting new gameplay styles that hardcore players really want. But it's not so many cards that it will overwhelm kind of these new players who are coming into Hearthstone for the first time just after we launch the game, and kind of turn them away. So, but we do plan on doing expansions as well.
Okay.
Just the pace. Well, we have to figure out the right pace. We have to make sure that we do it at, you know, so that we don't, the hardcore players aren't like, oh, you know, I feel like I've solved this meta game and I'm ready for new stuff. We want to give it to them before they feel like they've got it already. But without, you know, it's tricky. I think we still have to figure out exactly the right time frame.
Makes sense. But I want to, so with these adventures, these single player adventures, then are these cards that you earn that you'll be able to take into multiplayer, is what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just basically like, if you imagine like a 20 to 30 card set of new cards, that we're taking some risks. We're doing some crazy stuff, and
nothing wrong with that.
We're exploring mechanics that we've kind of already got in the game, so we're not introducing kind of new keywords to learn or anything, but we are kind of going some new places, and I think we got some really exciting stuff in the adventures.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. I mean, back in the WoW TCG, the original, there were, you know, the raid decks and things like that, and you could sort of do co-op kind of thing. So it'd be cool to see some of that come to Hearthstone as well. I think, let's see, as far as everything goes, I think we've pretty much covered everything I've had here. So I guess I'll just say, is there anything you want to mention as well? I mean, while you're on?
You know, well, we just patched, I guess, yesterday, was it?
Yep.
So I'm really excited about all the new stuff we put in. I've been playing Elite Torn Chieftain in one of my crazy decks, and trying a lot of the new ranked modes. So if you have any feedback on the ranked mode or the new stuff in the game, you know, you can post on the forums. You can hit me up on Twitter. I love hearing kind of what people are saying, even if it's complaining about mages. It's very useful for me to get kind of that pace of the pulse of what the community thinks and kind of what they're worried about or what they're excited about. So I love to hear all that feedback.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I guess that should about do it for today then, for Turn 2. Thanks so much, and thanks for staying some extra time to answer a few more questions, of course. And you can follow Ben on Twitter. His Twitter is right on the screen there at BD Is it Brody or Brode? I'm so sorry. I should have asked this before. Brode. Okay, that's what I thought. I'm glad my assumption was correct, because I've got a last name that people always mess up. So I understand. So I guess that's about it. Thanks for coming on Turn 2. Looking forward to seeing more Hearthstone, more changes in the game. Nice little water advertisement there. Hopefully you get that sponsorship very soon. And that's about it. So thanks for watching, guys. And we will see you next time. Next week on Turn 2. Oh, and I want to mention as well, the King of the Hill won't be airing right after this like it was going to. We had some technical glitches, so that'll be coming as soon as possible. So I know, technology, hooray. But anyway, that's it. We'll see you next time, guys. Thanks for watching.
Peace.